That's the moment Donald Trump discovered that intimidating America's largest trading partner carried unexpected consequences. Corporate boardrooms across Manhattan woke up rattled by this scene today. Red figures are streaming downward across trading screens on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Analysts are rushing to dial their contacts in Toronto, and you're watching the unmistakable signs of a major strategic miscalculation unfold live. At 5:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Monday, February 23, 2026, Donald Trump launched what he considered his strongest strike against Canada, a 25% tariff slapped on every Canadian product entering the United States, delivered through nothing more than a social media post designed to force Canada into submission. No talks, no heads up. What followed shook the entire global economy. Canada's newly chosen Prime Minister, Mark Carney, had just been handed the kind of crisis Trump assumed would be impossible to manage. Carney was already steering a fragile power transition, facing internal demands to prove his economic chops and managing the intricate Ottawa-Washington dynamic. Yet Carney did something that sent Trump's inner circle into disarray. Rather than scrambling to make desperate calls begging for mercy, he fired back in 9 minutes with a response so precise and devastating that it completely flipped the power dynamic between the two nations. In this detailed breakdown, we will walk through everything that happened during those 9 minutes. We'll expose the crisis meetings now underway in the West Wing. We'll reveal the private conversations between U.S. chief executives and their legal teams as they grapple with the damage this will do to their bottom lines. And we'll explain why this single episode stands as perhaps the clearest evidence yet that Donald Trump fundamentally misunderstands how power actually works. In today's interconnected global economy, it isn't merely that Trump is losing the fight. He's watching live as someone who truly grasps international economics turns his favorite political tool, the tariff threat, right back against him. 3 weeks earlier, during a rambling speech at Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump complained that he was tired of Canada taking advantage of the United States. He promised sweeping tariffs on Canadian imports. The goal was to pressure Canada into rewriting trade deals in America's favor. It was meant to showcase strength, proving that no one, not even the closest neighbor, could push America around under his watch. He told supporters that factories would come streaming back across the border. He promised Canada would have no choice but to accept whatever terms he demanded. He painted a picture of Canadian officials showing up in Washington, humbled and desperate, ready to sign anything put in front of them. But the damage went far beyond economic disruption. 70 years of North American economic partnership were thrown out the window. That meant tearing apart supply chains American companies had spent decades building. Businesses lost the long-term certainty they need to make major investments. It violated the core principle that democracies do not wage economic war on each other. Canadian business leaders pushed back immediately. They argued that American firms would hurt just as badly as Canadian ones because of deeply intertwined supply chains. They pointed out that auto parts cross the border 7 times before a single car is finished. They reminded everyone that Canadian agriculture is vital to American supermarket shelves. Trump brushed all of it aside. He called it fear-mongering. He insisted they didn't understand how to negotiate. He claimed Canada depended far more on American buyers than America relied on Canadian raw materials. Trump was convinced they would never fight back. He figured a smaller economy would always buckle. When confronted by a much larger one, he assumed Mark Carney, a brand new prime minister with no experience in this kind of showdown, would fold first. He got it badly wrong. At 11:43 a.m. on Thursday, February 20th, 2026, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social. The message was short, brutal, and crafted for maximum shock value. A flat 25% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the U.S., effective immediately. No transition, no exemptions, just an economic sledgehammer dropped without warning. For 4 minutes, there was silence. Financial markets hadn't fully processed it yet. Trading algorithms were still running the numbers. Canadian officials were probably double-checking whether the post was real or some kind of error. Then, at 11:52 a.m., exactly 9 minutes later, Mark Carney stepped in front of the cameras in Ottawa. No teleprompter, no prepared notes. Just a former Bank of England governor who had spent years mastering how to handle economic threats. He announced that American products would face immediate mirror tariffs. But he didn't stop there. He stated Canada would immediately explore new economic partnerships with Asia and the European Union. He promised instant government support for the hardest-hit Canadian sectors. And in the most damaging move, he revealed that Canada would restrict energy shipments to certain U.S. states heavily dependent on Canadian natural gas and electricity. People in the room described Carney as utterly calm, the steady tone of someone explaining a simple equation, no raised voice, no visible anger. The contrast with Trump's bombastic announcement couldn't have been sharper, but that was only the beginning. While Carney was speaking in Ottawa, the New York Stock Exchange teetered on the edge. Within minutes, U.S. automaker stocks dropped 4%. Midwest energy companies began sliding. Traders scrambled to model the real cost of an all-out trade war with Canada. At that same moment, Canadian provincial premiers were already on urgent calls with their American counterparts. Auto executives were ringing Michigan's governor to understand the factory impact. Montana's governor received briefings on potential Canadian energy cutoffs. Natural gas flows started to slow, most dramatically within 15 minutes of Carney's statement. 3 major American business lobbying organizations issued statements condemning Trump's tariffs, not cautiously, not as a warning, but outright opposition. The American Petroleum Institute, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce all publicly broke with a sitting president in real time. By day's end, the S&P 500 had shed 127 points. More than $400 billion in market value evaporated in under 6 hours. Wall Street trading desks ran endless what-if scenarios. What if this spirals? What if Canada follows through? What if other countries watch and decide Trump's threats are empty? Markets don't care about tough social media talk. They value stable alliances and predictable trade rules. On February 20th, they saw neither. White House leaks say an emergency meeting was called at 12:30 p.m. Trump's chief of staff, his remaining economic team, and several panicked congressional leaders dialing in to demand what was happening. The discussion wasn't about doubling down on tariffs. It was about how to stop the damage. People familiar with the conversation say it did not go smoothly. One aide reportedly asked Trump straight out whether anyone had game-planned Canada's reaction. Trump supposedly answered that he never thought Canada would have the guts to push back. Another advisor pointed out that Mark Carney wasn't some rookie who could be bullied. He had actually run the Bank of England and guided the British economy through Brexit. While no full transcript exists, sources describe visible frustration. Several people had been warning for weeks that threatening Canada wasn't the same as threatening China or Mexico. Canada had options. Canada had partners. Above all, Canada now had a new leader with zero incentive to back down. Carney's team made a cold, calculated political judgment. They weighed the short-term pain Canadian exporters would suffer. They considered the domestic pressure on Carney to show backbone against U.S. pressure. They looked ahead to the next election cycle, where appearing to surrender sovereignty would be politically fatal. They realized Trump had just handed them the perfect opportunity to frame Carney as a strong, capable global figure. In 9 minutes, the decision was locked. Retaliate immediately, retaliate hard, and make it crystal clear Canada would never play the role Trump had scripted for it. One insider says an advisor asked whether they should pause and coordinate with allies before releasing Carney's statement. Carney's reported reply was direct. No, we answer right now. By acting alone, we show the world that targeting Canada carries consequences. That's exactly what he did, but why? Consider the political upside. Mark Carney was built by Canada's economic establishment. Former global financial regulator, former central banker, technocrat, elected on a promise of competent economic stewardship. Yet competent managers don't win re-election. Leaders who stand up to bullies do. His base wanted steady, predictable trade policy. But they also wanted a prime minister who refused to be intimidated. Sources say Carney and his closest advisors ran numerous war game sessions preparing for exactly this move from Trump. They were ready. The 9-minute response wasn't improvised. It had been scripted, rehearsed, and waiting for the trigger in ways unimaginable 6 months earlier. Power shifted from Washington to Ottawa in that moment. Threatening your neighbor no longer guarantees compliance. Trump's entire team had operated on assumptions this response shattered. Economic size alone no longer wins fights. He can no longer predict how opponents will behave. He's reduced to a man with a social media account and a track record of threats that keep backfiring. Trump thought he was cornering a weaker economy by hitting Canada. Instead, he cornered himself. When financial markets punish your words, when major American business groups turn against you instantly, when your own governors flood the White House with frantic calls, you've committed a serious blunder. History will call it the 9-minute reversal. This was a coordinated international pushback against a unilateral American move. This isn't simply a trade quarrel. The way America's allies and neighbors respond to economic coercion has changed forever. Legal consequences are mounting. The trade deal Trump himself negotiated and signed, the USMCA, contains specific rules about tariffs. Legal scholars say his sudden unilateral action violates the very agreement he championed. Canada has already announced it will file formal complaints through the Pact's dispute settlement mechanism. The charges include tariff schedule breaches, most favored nation violations, and improper procedures for imposing new duties. Canada isn't acting alone. It's using Trump's own deal against him. If this heads to a dispute panel and the United States loses, it could trigger a broader crisis of confidence in American treaty promises, showing the world that the U.S. makes commitments it has no intention of honoring. That's the domino effect, worrying economists. If these tariffs stick, American companies dependent on Canadian imports face a sudden 25% cost spike overnight. Either they pass those costs to consumers and inflation climbs, or they eat the costs and profits and stock prices collapse. If Canada enforces energy restrictions, parts of the American Midwest could see power disruptions. Factories shut when electricity falters, unemployment ticks up in manufacturing regions. When manufacturers close in swing states, Trump's political base fractures. We're looking at a scenario where Trump's attempt to look tough could spark a recession precisely in the regions that back him most. The European Union is watching closely. They see a Canadian prime minister successfully defy American economic pressure. They see American markets punish Trump's move. They're calculating whether now is the moment to push back against other Trump threats. It's easier to isolate a floundering Trump on multiple fronts once his signature tactic visibly fails. China is watching and taking notes. They see that fast, coordinated counterstrikes work. They see Trump's threats losing credibility. They're adjusting their own trade strategies accordingly. Even Elon Musk, Trump's most prominent business ally, stays silent. Musk's operations rely on smooth supply lines. His American plants use Canadian components. Like everyone else, his profit margins are taking a hit from this trade clash. The stream of CEOs who once filled Mar-a-Lago dinners has vanished. Quiet. Behind closed doors, they're meeting with boards and lawyers to shield their companies from a president who makes billion-dollar economic calls via social media without consulting anyone. Why the silence? The math is brutally simple. Backing Trump here means endorsing a policy that costs billions. They're distancing themselves as fast as possible. That fractures Trump's coalition beyond repair. On one side sits the populist base that loves talk of American toughness, cheers being hard on Canada, and dismisses corporate whining or market drops. On the other side are the economic players who fund Republican campaigns, demand stable trade rules, and watch their portfolios shrink because of Trump's impulsive decisions. You can't win elections with a coalition that divided. You can't hold long-term power when the Republican Party splits between trade-dependent businesses and populists who want trade wars. People close to Trump say he's fixated on the media coverage. He's watching channels run split screens of his own angry social posts next to Mark Carney's calm, measured reply. He's scrolling through statements from business leaders. He's repeatedly asking aides why the market is tanking, why his strong stance isn't being cheered, and why Canada didn't fold the way he expected. He's confronting what happens when the narrative he sells no longer matches reality. Staff are reportedly trying to limit his access to polls, showing independent voters souring on the trade fight. They're shielding him from the growing number of congressional Republicans quietly expressing alarm. The stock market plunge is more than symbolic. It's a verdict. It reflects the collective judgment of thousands of sophisticated investors whose job is to price risk and opportunity correctly. They're unanimously signaling that Trump's Canada policy increases instability and harm to American interests. Trump wanted to project strength. He ended up projecting recklessness. He aimed to force Canada to submit. Instead, he unified Canadian politics around a leader now viewed as a hero for standing up to the neighborhood bully. Where things stand, Trump is at Mar-a-Lago surrounded by an increasingly small circle of advisors, reluctant to tell him the strategy is failing. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has abandoned him. Midwestern energy firms have abandoned him. Automakers have abandoned him. On the international stage, his own trade agreement is being wielded as evidence against him. He remains president of the United States, yet he has almost no control over the consequences of his own decisions. He can post online, but he can't compel Canada to obey. He can levy tariffs, but he can't prevent American companies from paying the price. He holds formal power, yet he lacks the practical ability to achieve the outcomes he announces. Expect escalation in the next phase of this crisis. In an effort to prove he was right, Trump will likely push even harsher measures. Additional tariffs on more Canadian sectors, perhaps even threatening to withdraw from the USMCA entirely, triggering a continent-wide trade war. None of that can undo what's already happened. The evidence is in. Threatening Canada triggers a swift, carefully planned, devastating reply. International relations courses will study the 9 minutes between Trump's post and Carney's response as the moment the myth of American economic dominance through intimidation collapsed. There is no returning to the old playbook. When a president starts a trade war with America's closest ally and is immediately punished by markets, the illusion that economic bullying carries no cost is shattered. The American business community has lost confidence in Trump. When your own Chamber of Commerce denounces your flagship policy within hours of its announcement, when your choices send stocks crashing, when a foreign leader outmaneuvers and outresponds you, making you look weak, you don't recover that credibility. Sign up. Over the next 90 days, we will track the dispute resolution proceedings. We'll examine what a Canadian legal victory would mean for the future of U.S. trade policy. Right now, the world is still absorbing that Donald Trump is struggling to understand what just happened when Mark Carney answered in 9 minutes. Stay tuned, pay close attention.